The story of alcohol, from ancient fermentation to the modern world. What if I told you that alcohol is almost as old as civilization itself? Long before whiskey, beer, wine, or cocktails existed, ancient humans were already discovering one of nature's most fascinating transformations, fermentation. And the story of alcohol isn't just a story about drinking. It's a story about agriculture, religion, science, war, trade, medicine, and the rise and fall of civilizations. So how did humans first discover alcohol? The first accidental drink. Imagine living thousands of years ago. You've just harvested some wild fruit and left it in a container. Days later, the fruit starts to break down. Wild yeast from the environment begins consuming the natural sugars in the fruit, and something unexpected happens. The sugars are transformed into alcohol. Nobody knows exactly when this happened for the first time, but naturally fermented drinks could have appeared long before written history. Our ancestors didn't need laboratories to make alcohol. Nature was already doing the chemistry for them, and humans were very good at noticing when nature produced something interesting. Beer may be older than civilization. One of the oldest alcoholic beverages known to humanity is beer. Evidence suggests that people in the ancient Near East were producing fermented beverages thousands of years ago, possibly as far back as the Neolithic period. When humans began growing grains such as barley, they accidentally created the perfect ingredients for fermentation. Grain contains starch. With the right process, that starch can be converted into sugars. Yeast can then transform those sugars into alcohol. For early agricultural societies, beer wasn't simply a recreational drink. It could be an important source of calories and nutrition, and it was often safer to consume than untreated water because fermentation and brewing could reduce certain harmful microorganisms. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer became deeply connected with everyday life and religion. The Sumerians even had a goddess associated with beer, Ninkasi. So alcohol wasn't something civilization discovered after becoming advanced. In some ways, alcohol developed alongside civilization. Ancient Egypt, beer for everyone. Thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, beer was consumed by people across society. Workers could receive beer as part of their daily provisions. It was also used in religious ceremonies and offerings. Wine was important too, although it was generally more associated with wealth and status than beer. The Egyptians cultivated vineyards and developed increasingly sophisticated methods of winemaking. Alcohol had now become more than something that happened naturally. It had become an industry. The Greeks and the Romans. As civilizations expanded, alcohol traveled with them. The ancient Greeks developed a sophisticated wine culture. Wine wasn't simply something people drank at dinner. It played a major role in social life, philosophy, religion, and politics. The Greeks often diluted wine with water, especially during gatherings known as symposia. These gatherings could involve food, conversation, music, and philosophical debate. In other words, wine wasn't merely a beverage, it was part of the culture. The Romans later expanded wine production across huge parts of Europe. As the Roman Empire grew, vineyards spread into regions that are now France, Spain, Germany, and other parts of Europe. Many of today's famous European wine regions can trace aspects of their wine traditions back to this ancient expansion. The mystery of distillation. But fermentation has a limit. Yeast generally cannot survive in extremely high concentrations of alcohol. So if humans wanted something much stronger than beer or wine, they needed another technology. That technology was distillation. Distillation works by separating alcohol from a fermented liquid based on differences in volatility. Early forms of distillation were developed and refined over centuries, with important contributions from scientists and alchemists in the ancient world and later the medieval Islamic world. Distillation wasn't originally invented simply to make stronger drinks. It was also used in medicine, perfumes, chemistry, and alchemy. Eventually, however, people discovered that distilled fermented liquids could produce powerful alcoholic spirits, and that changed everything. The birth of spirits. As distillation technology improved, stronger drinks began appearing in different parts of the world. In Europe, distilled beverages eventually evolved into spirits, such as brandy, vodka, gin, rum, and whiskey. Each developed its own history. Brandy could be made by distilling wine. Whiskey emerged from traditions of distilling fermented grains, particularly in Ireland and Scotland. Rum became closely connected with sugar production in the Caribbean. Vodka developed in Eastern Europe. Gin became especially associated with England. These drinks weren't created in a single moment by a single inventor. They evolved through centuries of experimentation. Alcohol and religion. Alcohol has also had a complicated relationship with religion. In some traditions, wine became an important religious symbol. In others, alcohol was restricted or prohibited. Religious attitudes toward drinking have shaped laws and cultures for thousands of years, and those attitudes still influence alcohol regulations around the world today. Alcohol crosses the Atlantic. When Europeans colonized the Americas, alcohol became part of the exchange of crops, technologies, and cultures. European settlers brought brewing and distilling traditions with them, but the Americas already had their own traditions of producing fermented beverages from local plants and crops. Indigenous peoples across the Americas made a variety of fermented drinks using ingredients such as corn, agave, fruits, and other native plants. So the history of alcohol in the Americas wasn't simply imported from Europe. It was a combination of existing indigenous traditions and newly introduced European technologies and ingredients. The Whiskey Revolution. In colonial North America, distilled spirits became increasingly important. Grains could be turned into whiskey, while Caribbean sugar production created enormous quantities of molasses that could be fermented and distilled into rum. Rum became a major commodity in colonial trade. Later, whiskey production became deeply connected with the United States. In fact, alcohol became so important economically that it contributed to one of the earliest major tax revolts in American history. In 1791, the new U.S. government imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits. Many farmers and distillers strongly opposed it. The conflict escalated into what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. President George Washington eventually sent troops to enforce federal authority. Alcohol wasn't just sitting at the bar, it was influencing American politics. The dark side of alcohol. But the history of alcohol isn't a celebration. Alcohol has always had a darker side. As stronger spirits became widely available, excessive drinking contributed to social problems, addiction, family hardship, workplace accidents, and health problems. By the 19th century, concern about alcohol consumption had become a major political and social movement in the United States. This eventually helped produce one of the most controversial experiments in American history. Prohibition. In 1920, the United States entered Prohibition. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act effectively prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating alcoholic beverages. But there was one major problem. People still wanted to drink. Illegal bars known as speakeasies appeared across the country. Bootlegging became a major criminal business. Organized crime groups made enormous profits from illegal alcohol, and after more than a decade, Prohibition ended. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. It remains the only U.S. constitutional amendment ever repealed by another amendment. Alcohol today. Today, alcohol is one of the most widely consumed recreational substances in the world. We have enormous industries built around beer, wine, and spirits. We have sophisticated breweries, vineyards, distilleries, cocktail bars, and alcohol-free alternatives. And modern science understands fermentation and distillation far better than our ancestors ever could. But the basic process hasn't changed. Yeast still consumes sugar, fermentation still produces alcohol, and humans are still fascinated by the result. The story of alcohol is ultimately the story of human civilization. It began with nature. Humans discovered fermentation. Agriculture gave us grains and grapes. Civilizations turned alcohol into food, medicine, religion, trade, and culture. Science gave us distillation. Empires spread alcoholic traditions around the world. Governments taxed it. Movements tried to ban it. Criminal organizations fought over it. And today, billions of people live in societies where alcohol remains part of everyday life. So the next time you see a glass of beer, wine, or whiskey, remember, you're not just looking at a drink. You're looking at the result of thousands of years of human experimentation, culture, science, and history. And perhaps the strangest part of the story is that it all began with something incredibly simple: sugar, yeast, and time.